The laughter started before I even sat down. "Can you cook?" Blake Whitmore asked from the far end of the table. The whole room cracked up. I smiled, set down my wine glass, and said, "Only if it's easier than landing a Black Hawk in a sandstorm." More laughter. Everyone thought I was joking. Everyone except one man. A retired 3-star Army aviation general nearly dropped his bourbon. That was the moment everything changed. At the time, though, I didn't know it. I was just trying to get through another Saturday night. The party was at Blake and Marcy Whitmore's house in Preston Hollow, one of those wealthy Dallas neighborhoods where every driveway looks like a luxury car dealership, and every backyard seems designed by someone who hates grass and loves outdoor kitchens. My husband Greg loved these events. I tolerated them. By the time we pulled into the circular driveway that evening, my right knee was already throbbing. It had been raining on and off all week, and old injuries have a way of keeping their own weather forecast. I sat in the passenger seat for a moment before getting out. "You okay?" Greg asked. "Just stiff." He nodded. Not concerned, not dismissive. Just used to it. That somehow felt worse. After 20 years together, pain had become part of the furniture. Something neither of us really talked about anymore. I smoothed down my dress before walking inside. The dress wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was just honest. A little tighter around the waist than dresses used to be. At 43, after years of injuries, surgeries, and too many drive-through dinners during rehabilitation appointments, my body no longer looked like it did when I was flying helicopters. I'd made peace with most of that. Most days. Inside the house smelled like grilled steaks and expensive candles. Country music drifted softly from hidden speakers. People stood around holding drinks and discussing golf scores, property taxes, and the Cowboys. The usual. Blake spotted us immediately. "Greg, there he is." The two men shook hands. Then Blake turned toward me. "And Sarah." Not unfriendly. Just an afterthought. I smiled politely. Within minutes, Greg had disappeared into a conversation about commercial roofing contracts. I found myself standing near the kitchen island with the wives. Or at least that's what everyone called us. The wives. As if we all belonged in the same category. Marcy poured herself wine. "So what do you do all day now, Sarah?" There was no malice in her voice. Just curiosity. The kind that assumes there's probably not much to hear. "Oh, a little of this and that." She nodded, then immediately turned to another woman to discuss grandchildren. I didn't have kids. That usually ended those conversations. About an hour later, everyone gathered around the long dining table. The men sat together naturally. The women filled in the remaining chairs. I ended up across from Blake. Beside him sat Duke Hollander, a retired salesman who somehow managed to become an expert on every topic within 30 seconds of hearing about it. Duke had opinions about football, politics, medicine, the military, especially the military. People like Duke always fascinated me. The less they knew, the more confident they sounded. Dinner had barely started when the jokes began. Blake looked at Greg. "You're a lucky man." Greg grinned. "I know." Marcy rolled her eyes. "You better say that." Blake pointed his fork toward me. "So Sarah, serious question. I already knew where this was going. What's that? Can you actually cook?" A few people laughed. I smiled politely. Blake continued. "I mean, Greg's always taking clients out to dinner. That's usually a bad sign." More laughter. I looked at Greg. For 1 second. Just one. Waiting. Hoping. Maybe he'd say something. Maybe he'd redirect the conversation. Maybe he'd remind them who his wife actually was. Instead, he chuckled into his drink. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough. Something settled inside me. Not anger. Not yet. More like disappointment finally getting comfortable. Blake spread his hands dramatically. "Come on, Sarah, settle the debate." The table waited. I took a sip of water. Then I shrugged. Only if it's easier than landing a Black Hawk in a sandstorm. The timing was perfect. Half the table laughed before I even finished. Duke slapped the table. "That's a good one." Someone else repeated it. More laughter. And then I noticed the silence. One person wasn't laughing. Lieutenant General Frank Dawson. Retired. 70-something. Silver hair. Sharp eyes. The kind of man who could sit quietly for an hour and still somehow dominate a room. His bourbon glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed. He looked directly at me. Not through me. At me. I felt my stomach tighten. Because I knew that look. Recognition. The conversation around us continued. Nobody else noticed. But Frank kept staring. A few minutes later, he leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me." The table quieted. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He looked at me. Captain Mitchell, every sound in the room seemed to disappear. For a second, all I could hear was the hum of the air conditioning. My heart kicked once. Hard. Nobody had called me that in years. Not doctor. Not ma'am. Not Mrs. Mitchell. Captain. I glanced at Greg. He looked confused. Blake looked confused. Everyone looked confused. Except Frank. I managed a small smile. Not anymore. Frank studied me another second. Then he nodded slowly. I thought so. And that was it. He didn't explain. Didn't tell stories. Didn't embarrass me. He simply returned to his drink. The conversation eventually moved on. But I could feel people sneaking glances at me for the rest of the evening. When Greg and I finally got ready to leave, I felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Outside, the September air was still warm. Valet attendants moved cars through the driveway. Guests lingered near the front entrance. Greg walked ahead toward our SUV. I was halfway there when someone called my name. Sarah. I turned. Frank Dawson stood a few feet away. The outdoor lights cast long shadows across the driveway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he handed me a business card. I'd appreciate a phone call. I looked down. Simple card. Name. Number. Nothing else. General. Frank. I nodded. Frank. His expression softened. Just slightly. You may not remember me. I remember the name. I figured. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say more. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen, and wrote something on the back of the card. Then he handed it back. I looked down. 6 words. We need to talk about Kandahar 2011. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Not visibly. Just enough. Enough to bring back memories I hadn't touched in over a decade. Enough to make my pulse start racing. When I looked up again, Frank was already walking toward his car. I stood there staring at the card. Behind me, Greg called from the driver's seat. You coming? I folded the card carefully and slipped it into my purse. Then I walked toward the SUV. For the first time all night, I wasn't thinking about Blake. Or Duke. Or the dinner table. I was thinking about Kandahar. And wondering why, after all these years, someone had finally opened that door. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words Frank had written on that business card. Kandahar 2011. 6 simple words. 6 words that carried more weight than most people would understand. By 2 in the morning, I was sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't need. The house was quiet. Greg had gone to bed an hour earlier. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. Rain tapped against the windows. I rubbed my knee and stared at the card again. For years, I had worked very hard not to think about Afghanistan. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I was hiding anything. Life had simply moved on. Or at least I had tried to convince myself it had. Most veterans I know understand that feeling. You spend years surviving one life. Then suddenly you're expected to build another. The transition sounds easier than it is. At some point the stories stop coming up. The photographs get packed away. The uniforms disappear into closets. People stop asking questions, and eventually you stop volunteering answers. I heard footsteps behind me. Greg shuffled into the kitchen wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt. He opened the refrigerator. You okay? I shrugged. Couldn't sleep. He grabbed a bottle of water. Still thinking about tonight. I looked at him. Which part? He frowned slightly. The weird thing with Frank? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. The weird thing. That was his takeaway. Not the jokes. Not the dinner conversation. Not the way his friends had treated me like decorative furniture. The weird thing was the retired general recognizing me. I guess, I said. Greg twisted the cap off the bottle. You ever know him? A little. Military stuff? Military stuff. He nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he headed back toward the bedroom. Halfway down the hallway, he stopped. You know Blake was kidding, right? There it was. The sentence I knew was coming. The defense. The explanation. The excuse. I stared at the kitchen table. Good night, Greg. A few seconds later, I heard the bedroom door close. I sat there for another hour, alone. The funny thing about disrespect is that it rarely arrives all at once. People imagine some giant betrayal, some explosive moment. Usually it happens slowly. A joke here, a dismissal there, a conversation where nobody asks your opinion, a story that never gets told, a photograph that quietly disappears from the wall. One day you wake up and realize you've been shrinking for years, and somehow nobody noticed, including you. Around sunrise, I finally went upstairs, but I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I opened a storage closet. A few minutes later, I found an old plastic bin. Inside were photo albums, military paperwork, flight logs, pieces of another life. I sat on the floor and started flipping through them. There I was at 22, skinny, sunburned, looking terrified on my first day of flight school. A few pages later, I was standing beside a Black Hawk helicopter. Then another picture, and another. Years of memories, some good, some hard, all of them real. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My father repaired diesel engines. My mother worked nights at St. Francis Hospital. Neither of them had much money. What they did have was discipline. You showed up. You worked hard. You finished what you started. After September 11th, something changed in me, like it changed in a lot of people. I wanted purpose. I wanted challenge. I wanted to matter. So I joined the Army. Nobody expected me to become a pilot. Honestly, neither did I. But the first time I sat in a helicopter cockpit, I was hooked. Some people find a calling. Others stumble into it. For me, it happened somewhere over Texas during a training flight. The moment the aircraft lifted off the ground, I knew. This was it. This was mine. The years that followed were some of the hardest and best years of my life. I flew in Iraq, Afghanistan, dust storms, mountain valleys, night operations, medical evacuations, supply runs, troop transport missions. The work wasn't glamorous. Most military work isn't. But it mattered. And that's enough. Eventually, I found myself in Afghanistan in 2011. Kandahar province, the place Frank had written on that card. I closed the photo album. My chest felt tight. Some memories never really fade. You just learn where to store them. Around 9 that morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I knew who it was before answering. Hello, Captain Mitchell. Frank. His voice sounded exactly the same as it had the night before. Calm. Direct. No wasted words. Morning, General. Frank? Sorry, Frank. I heard a chuckle. How are you holding up? Honestly? I prefer honestly. I looked out the kitchen window. Confused. Fair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Frank got right to the point. I spent part of last night reviewing old records. That made me sit up straighter. What records? Kandahar. I felt my stomach tighten. The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. You still have access to those? I know people. That answer somehow sounded perfectly reasonable coming from him. What exactly are you looking for? The truth. I laughed softly. You'll need to be more specific. The mission is being reviewed for final declassification. That got my attention. What? I thought you knew. No, Frank sighed. They've been working through old operations from that period. Yours is one of them. I sat there trying to process that. For years, nobody had talked about Kandahar. Nobody. Not publicly. Not privately. Not even among veterans. Now suddenly it was being reviewed. Why? Because enough time has passed. I leaned back in my chair. The answer made sense. I just wasn't ready for it. Frank continued. I reread the after-action reports. Silence. Then, you saved lives that day. I closed my eyes. The memories came back immediately. Rotor noise. Sand. Radio traffic. Fear. Responsibility. Choices. A lot of choices. You don't need to tell me that. No. His voice softened. But maybe somebody else does. I didn't answer. Because I knew where this conversation was heading. And I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. Frank kept going. There's a Veterans Aviation Foundation hosting an event in Dallas next month. I rubbed my forehead. Frank. Just listen. So I did. The board wants to recognize several veterans connected to recently declassified operations. I felt my pulse speeding up. You're one of them. I stared across the kitchen. The room suddenly felt smaller. No. You haven't even heard the details. I don't need details. You deserve this. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it felt impossible. Frank, I haven't flown in years. That doesn't change what happened. I'm not that person anymore. The words came out before I could stop them. Silence. Then Frank answered, That's where you're wrong. I swallowed. You don't know me. Maybe not. His voice remained steady. But I know what tired sounds like. That landed harder than I expected. Because it was true. I was tired. Tired of explaining myself. Tired of being overlooked. Tired of carrying pieces of a life nobody seemed interested in remembering. Frank let the silence sit for a few seconds. Then he added one final thing. Something I wasn't prepared for. The event is tied to a military aviation fundraiser. I nodded absent-mindedly. Okay. One of the major sponsors is Lone Star Commercial Roofing. My heart skipped. Lone Star Commercial Roofing. Greg's company. I sat up. What? You didn't know? No. Frank exhaled slowly. Well, I could practically hear him choosing his words. Sounds like your husband doesn't know much about this yet either. I stared out the window as rain slid down the glass. Somewhere deep inside me something shifted. Not revenge. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just awareness. For the first time I realized this story might not stay buried. And if it didn't, a lot of people were about to learn things they never bothered asking about. I did not tell Greg about the phone call. That sounds worse than it felt at the time. I wasn't sneaking around. I wasn't plotting. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was simpler and uglier. I wanted one piece of my life that Greg had not already touched, minimized, explained away, or tucked behind one of his golf photos. So when Frank Dawson invited me to meet him at a veterans breakfast in Fort Worth the following Wednesday, I went. Greg thought I had a physical therapy appointment. That wasn't exactly a lie. My knee hurt badly enough that morning to qualify as medical activity. The breakfast was at a VFW hall off Camp Bowie Boulevard in a low brick building with faded flags near the entrance and a parking lot full of pickup trucks. Inside, the coffee was weak, the bacon was overcooked, and the folding chairs complained every time somebody shifted their weight. I loved it immediately. Not because it was fancy, because nobody there was pretending. A man near the door had a hearing aid that whistled every time he laughed. Two women in navy ball caps argued over whether VA parking had gotten worse. An older Marine with a cane told the same joke 3 times and everyone let him. There was something comforting about a room full of people who didn't need you to explain why you stood up slowly. Frank waved me over from a table near the back. He had 2 cups of coffee waiting. "Captain," he said. "Sarah," I corrected. He nodded once. "Sarah." I sat across from him. For a minute we talked like normal people. Weather, traffic, Dallas construction. The kind of small talk veterans use when the big talk is waiting in the corner like a dog that hasn't decided whether to bite. Finally, Frank reached into a leather folder and pulled out a few papers. Nothing classified. Just public-facing documents, he explained. Still seeing my name in that font on that kind of paper made my throat tighten. "I didn't make this happen," he said, "not by myself. But you pushed it." He smiled faintly. "I made a few phone calls. I bet your few phone calls sound different than most people's. That depends who's answering." I almost smiled. Almost. He tapped one page with his finger. "Your mission was already under review. The Foundation was looking for honorees connected to recently declassified operations. When I heard your name might be eligible, I encouraged them to stop dragging their feet." I stared at the papers. "Why?" Frank leaned back. "Because I read the report when it first came across my desk years ago. You remembered that. I remembered the pilot who landed when every sensible person would have turned back." I looked away. "That's not exactly how it happened." "No," he said, "it never is." That earned my respect more than praise would have. People who haven't been there love clean, heroic stories. They want courage without fear, decisions without doubt, war wrapped up like a movie scene with music underneath it. Real life is messier. That day near Kandahar was not pretty. It was sand, bad visibility radio calls stepping on each other, and men on the ground who needed a way out. I made a call. Other people did their jobs. Some of us went home limping. That was the truth. Frank studied me over the rim of his coffee cup. "You're wondering how I recognized you." "I am. Your name helped, your age, your face once I placed it. But mostly it was the way you answered that idiot at dinner." I looked at him. Frank shrugged. "People who make things up usually add too much detail. You didn't. You said it like somebody remembering weather. That hit me harder than I expected. Because he was right. I hadn't meant to say it. The line had simply come out. A reflex. Like bracing your hand against a wall when you lose balance. I didn't want anybody to know I said. "Why?" I laughed quietly. "Because then they ask questions. Questions are not always attacks. No, but sometimes they're invitations to bleed in public." Frank's expression changed. Not pity. Recognition. "I understand that." I believed him. After breakfast, I drove back toward Dallas with his folder on the passenger seat and a strange pressure behind my ribs. I should have felt proud. Mostly I felt exposed. That afternoon, I stopped by Greg's office to drop off his dry cleaning because he had forgotten it in my car. Lone Star Commercial Roofing had grown a lot in the last decade. What started as a small local contractor had turned into a business with polished floors, glass offices, and a receptionist who called Greg Mr. Mitchell, in a voice that sounded like she had practiced it. His assistant Linda waved me in. "He's on a call, but you can leave it in his office." I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Greg's office looked like a museum exhibit titled Successful Texas Man. Framed newspaper clipping, golf trophy, photo with a state senator, signed Cowboys helmet, a shadow box with his old army patches. I looked at that shadow box longer than I meant to. Greg had served. I want to be fair about that. He served honorably. He wore the uniform. He did his time. But over the years around business clients and country club men, he had learned to let silence do some generous work. If somebody assumed he had deployed more than he had, he didn't correct them. If someone called him a combat guy, he smiled in that modest way men use when they want credit without making a claim. I used to tell myself it didn't matter. Maybe it didn't. Until I realized my real history had become inconvenient beside his polished version. On the credenza behind his desk sat a framed photo of us from a charity gala. Beside it, a picture of Greg holding a golf trophy. There had once been another photo there, me in uniform, standing beside a Black Hawk with dust on my face and my hair tucked under my helmet. I remembered because Greg used to say it was his favorite. It was gone. That night I checked our shared digital album. I felt foolish doing it, like a suspicious wife in a cheap TV movie. But I checked anyway. Some photos were still there. Vacation pictures, Christmas, house projects, Greg shaking hands with donors. But the cockpit photo was missing. So was my promotion ceremony. So was the one from Kandahar after we got back to base, the one where I looked so tired I barely recognized myself. Not all my military pictures were gone. Just the ones where I looked like someone nobody could dismiss. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at blank spaces where my life used to be. Greg came in from the garage. "You okay?" I closed the laptop. "Fine." He tossed his keys into the bowl near the door. "I'm starving. You want to order Mexican?" I almost laughed. After everything, after all the little removals there, he was asking about dinner. "Sure," I said. "Manny's." "Perfect." And that was marriage sometimes. Not always a blow-up. Sometimes it was a woman sitting at a table realizing her husband had been editing her life in small, quiet ways, while he asked whether she wanted fajitas. The next Saturday, we went to a golf fundraiser at Brookhaven Country Club. I didn't want to go. Greg said it would mean a lot. That phrase had gotten me into more unpleasant rooms than I care to admit. Duke Hollander found me near the buffet holding a tiny plate with 2 shrimp and 1 sad piece of melon. "There she is," he said, "our helicopter comedian." I smiled. "Duke." He pointed his drink at me. "You know, those Blackhawks are basically flying tanks, sweetheart." I looked at him. "They're not tanks." "Well, you know what I mean." "Not really." He chuckled, missing the warning. "I watched a whole documentary on those things. Incredible machines. Pretty much fly themselves now, don't they?" I tilted my head. "Have you ever auto-rotated one into a dust bowl with a tailwind?" Duke blinked. "Well, not personally. That's usually where the brochure gets thin." For one glorious second, Duke had no idea what to do with his face. Then he laughed too loudly and excused himself to get another drink. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt tired. There is a kind of humor that protects you, and there is a kind that reminds you protection was necessary. 3 days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Heavy cream paper. Formal. The kind people use when they want an event to feel important. I opened it in the kitchen with a paring knife because I couldn't find the letter opener. Inside was the official invitation. Military Aviation Heritage Foundation, Annual Recognition Dinner Frontiers of Flight Museum, Dallas, Texas. My eyes moved down the page. Guest of honor, Captain Sarah Mitchell. I sat down slowly. For a while, I just stared at my name. Not because I didn't recognize it. Because I did. That was the problem. I had spent so long answering to other versions of myself. Mrs. Mitchell. Greg's wife. Ma'am? Sweetheart. That old rank on thick paper felt like a hand reaching through time. Then I noticed the sponsor list printed at the bottom. There it was. First line. Lone Star Commercial Roofing. Greg's company. I held the invitation in both hands and listened to the quiet house around me. Greg still had no idea. And for the first time in years, I decided not to rush in and protect him from what he failed to see. I wish I could tell you I had some brilliant master plan. That I sat in my kitchen plotting revenge like a chess player thinking 5 moves ahead. I didn't. The truth is a lot less impressive. For several days after receiving the invitation, I did absolutely nothing. I went grocery shopping. I paid bills. I attended physical therapy. I folded laundry while watching old reruns of NCIS. Life kept moving. The only difference was that every morning I woke up knowing something Greg didn't. And every evening I went to bed wondering whether I should tell him. The answer kept changing. Some days I thought keeping quiet was petty. Other days I thought maybe I'd spent too many years protecting his feelings. One Thursday afternoon I was sitting on our back patio with a cup of iced tea when I finally admitted something to myself. I wasn't trying to embarrass Greg. I just didn't want to rescue him anymore. There was a difference. A big one. For years I had softened situations for him, explained things away, absorbed awkward moments, pretended not to notice. Now I was tired. Not angry, just tired. And tired people eventually stop carrying things that don't belong to them. A few days later, Frank called. We met at a small coffee shop near White Rock Lake. It was one of those places filled with retired teachers, laptop freelancers, and people who looked like they'd been ordering the same drink for 15 years. Frank arrived early. Of course he did. Men like Frank were physically incapable of arriving late. I found him sitting outside beneath a shade umbrella. He already had coffee waiting. "You're predictable," I said. "Experience," he replied. I sat down. For a few minutes we talked about the upcoming ceremony, guest lists, schedules, media attendance. Nothing dramatic. Then Frank surprised me. "You look troubled." I laughed. "That's because I am." "Want to talk about it?" I stared out toward the lake. A couple walked by holding hands. An older man fished from the shoreline. Life seemed very simple for everyone except me. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Frank waited. He was good at that. Most people rush to fill silence. Frank respected it. "I keep telling myself this isn't revenge," I finally said. But part of me wants Greg to feel what I've felt." Frank nodded slowly. "No shame in admitting that." "There should be." "No." He stirred his coffee. "There'd be shame in building your life around it." That one stayed with me. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Frank surprised me again. "You know why my first marriage ended?" I looked up. "No." "Because I treated my wife like support staff." I blinked. That wasn't the answer I expected. Frank smiled sadly. "I wasn't cruel, that's the trap." He leaned back. "I provided, I worked hard, I stayed faithful." "Sounds pretty good so far." That's what I thought. His smile faded. "But I assumed she'd always be there. I treated her achievements like side stories in my own biography. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." The comparison was obvious. Frank took a sip of coffee. "One day she left." "What happened?" "I spent about 5 years learning that decent men can still do real damage." The words landed hard. Because they felt true. Greg wasn't evil. That was part of the problem. It would have been easier if he were. Villains are simple. Insecure people are complicated. Frank glanced at me. "A man can survive being corrected." His voice softened. "What destroys him is refusing to grow afterward." When we finally left, I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. I thought about Greg, about us, about the 1,000 little moments that had brought us here. None of them seemed important at the time. Together they changed everything. The following week, Greg became obsessed with the aviation fundraiser. Not the military side, the networking side. Every conversation somehow returned to sponsorship opportunities, potential clients, future contracts, business relationships. One evening he came home carrying a folder and a level of excitement usually reserved for lottery winners. "You won't believe who's attending." I was chopping vegetables. "Who?" He dropped the folder on the counter. 3 city council members. I nodded. "That's nice." "And 2 major developers." Also nice. "And apparently some retired military leadership." I kept chopping. "Sounds like a good turnout." Greg grinned. "It'll be huge." There was a pause. Then he added, "You know we should probably buy you something nice to wear." I nearly cut my finger. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't. He still had absolutely no idea. I looked up. "What exactly is this event again?" "A recognition dinner." "For who?" He shrugged. "Some pilot." I had to look away. Immediately. Otherwise I would have laughed. Not out of cruelty, out of sheer disbelief. "Some pilot." "Yeah." He opened the refrigerator. "Frank Dawson is involved. Apparently the person did something important overseas years ago." I set down the knife. "And you've never looked into it?" "No." Greg grabbed a bottle of water. "Why would I—" "Good question. Why would he—" The answer sat between us, unspoken, heavy. The next few days got stranger. The closer we moved toward the ceremony, the more opportunities Greg had to discover the truth. And somehow he missed every one of them. His assistant printed event materials. He never read them. Sponsors received emails. He skimmed the first paragraph. Someone mentioned the honoree's name during a phone call. He took another call halfway through. It became almost absurd, like watching someone walk past a giant flashing sign because they're busy looking at their phone. Meanwhile, his friends remained exactly the same. Blake continued making jokes. Duke continued pretending expertise. Marcy continued evaluating every woman in every room like she was judging a county fair competition. Nothing changed, at least not for them. One Saturday evening, we attended another social gathering. A backyard barbecue this time. Blake arrived carrying a framed photograph. "You guys have to see this." Everyone gathered around. The picture showed Blake standing beside a helicopter. He looked ridiculously proud. "Who's that?" someone asked. "A legendary military pilot." I took one look. Stock photo backdrop. Corporate fundraising event. The pilot wasn't even in the picture. I nearly choked on my drink. Blake pointed proudly. "Great guy." "What's his name?" somebody asked. Blake stared at the picture. "A little too long." Then he said, "Mike." I walked away before I started laughing. Later that night, Greg drove us home. Traffic crawled along the Dallas North Tollway. Country music played quietly through the speakers. Everything felt normal. Too normal. The ceremony was now less than 24 hours away. I still hadn't said a word. Neither had Frank. Neither had anyone else. The truth was moving toward Greg like a freight train. And for once, I wasn't standing on the tracks waving warning flags. The next afternoon, Greg was in his home office reviewing sponsor materials. I was downstairs reading when I heard it. A sudden scraping sound. A chair moving. Hard. Then silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes you look up. I waited. Nothing. A minute later, I walked upstairs. Greg was standing behind his desk. Perfectly still. A printed program rested in his hands. His face had gone pale. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough that I knew immediately. He finally saw it. At the top of the page in bold letters, Guest of Honor. Captain Sarah Mitchell. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt strangely thin. Greg looked at me, then back at the paper, then at me again, as if trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. Finally, he whispered, "What is this?" And for the first time in years, I didn't answer right away. "What is this?" Greg's voice barely made it across the room. I looked at the program in his hand, then at him. For a second, I considered giving him the easy version. A quick explanation. A neat summary. Something that would help him catch up emotionally before the rest of the world did. Instead, I told the truth. It's a recognition ceremony. His eyes never left the paper. "You're the honoree?" "Looks that way." Silence. He read my name again. Like maybe it would change if he stared hard enough. Then he looked up. "Why didn't you tell me?" I leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted to." "Sarah." "A lot of times." He stopped talking, because we both knew that wasn't really the question. What he meant was, "Why didn't you protect me from this?" And for the first time, I wasn't going to. The next morning felt strangely calm. The argument everyone expects never happened. No yelling. No slammed doors. No dramatic accusations. Just two people moving around the same house carrying different kinds of regret. Greg barely spoke during breakfast. I barely pushed him. At one point, he looked at me across the kitchen table. "I honestly didn't know." "I know." That answer seemed to hurt more than if I'd accused him. Because ignorance wasn't much of a defense. Not after 20 years. The ceremony was scheduled for 6 o'clock at the Frontiers of Flight Museum near Love Field. I drove separately. That wasn't intentional. I simply had a meeting with Frank beforehand. At least that's what I told Greg. The truth was I needed an hour to breathe. The museum looked beautiful that evening. The setting sun reflected off polished aircraft displays. American flags lined the entrance. Volunteers greeted guests in navy blazers. Families wandered through exhibits. Veterans shook hands. Children pointed excitedly at airplanes hanging from the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, my nerves showed up. Not because of Greg. Not because of Blake. Not because of any revenge fantasy. Because suddenly this wasn't about a dinner party anymore. This was about people. Real people. Real memories. Real consequences. Frank found me near the entrance. "You look nervous." "I am nervous." "Good," I laughed. "That's supposed to help." "It means you're taking it seriously." He straightened his tie. "You'll be fine." I wasn't completely convinced, but I appreciated the effort. Guests continued arriving. Eventually, I spotted Greg. He entered with Blake, Duke, Marcy, and several business associates. The moment Blake saw me standing beside Frank Dawson, I watched confusion flicker across his face, then concern, then something very close to panic. Good. Not because I wanted him humiliated, because for once he was paying attention. Greg approached slowly. His smile looked painful. You look nice. Thank you. You too. Awkward. Very awkward. Frank shook Greg's hand politely. No hostility. No coldness. Just professionalism, which somehow made everything worse. We took our seats. Nearly 300 people filled the room. Veterans, donors, military families, city officials, reporters, a local television crew. The energy felt respectful. Not flashy. Not theatrical. Real. Dinner was served. Conversations drifted across the room. Then eventually the lights dimmed. The program began. A foundation representative welcomed everyone. Several veterans were recognized. A scholarship announcement followed. Then Frank walked toward the stage. The room immediately quieted. He didn't need a microphone to command attention. The microphone simply made it easier. Good evening. A few hundred people settled into silence. Frank glanced around the room, then began. He spoke about service, duty, responsibility, not in a political way, not in a patriotic commercial way, just honestly. Then he transitioned into the story. Kandahar, 2011. A joint special operations team. A deteriorating weather situation. Communication problems. An extraction window closing by the minute. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Across the room, Greg sat motionless. Frank never exaggerated. That was one of the things I respected most about him. He didn't turn difficult moments into movies. He told them like a professional. Simple, direct, human. There were opportunities to turn back. His voice carried through the room. There were reasons to wait. Nobody moved. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody whispered. Frank continued. But there were Americans on the ground who needed help. The room stayed silent. I could see veterans listening differently now, not hearing a speech, recognizing a memory. The pilot involved never asked for recognition. Frank paused. Never requested publicity. Another pause. In fact, she spent years avoiding it. Now people were looking around, searching, wondering. Frank smiled slightly. Which means she's probably going to be annoyed with me tonight. Laughter. Gentle laughter. The kind that releases tension. Then Frank looked toward my table. Toward me. Captain Sarah Mitchell. For a second I couldn't move. The applause started immediately. Then people stood. One row. Then another. Then another. A standing ovation. 300 people on their feet. The sound filled the room. I felt my throat tighten. Not because I thought I deserved it. Because I suddenly remembered all the people who weren't there. Crew members. Friends. People who had served. People who hadn't made it home. Frank extended his hand. I walked to the stage. The applause continued. As I stepped onto the platform, I glanced toward Greg's table. Blake looked stunned. Marcy looked embarrassed. Duke appeared as though someone had unplugged him. Greg looked devastated. Not because I was being honored, because he finally understood how much he had failed to see. Frank handed me the award. A simple plaque. Nothing flashy. Exactly the way I liked it. Then he stepped aside. The microphone waited. I took a breath. The room settled. I don't really know how to give speeches. A few people laughed. Most pilots aren't chosen for conversation skills. More laughter. Good. The tension eased. I looked around the room. At the families. The veterans. The faces. I appreciate this honor. I paused. But the truth is, nobody does these things alone. I spoke about crew chiefs, mechanics, medics, people who stayed behind the scenes, the men and women who kept aircraft flying, the families who carried burdens nobody else saw. I kept it short, honest, human. No hero speech, no dramatic ending, just gratitude. When I finished, the applause felt warmer somehow, less formal, more personal. Afterward came interviews, photos, handshakes, questions. Lots of questions. That's when the real reckoning started. A local reporter approached Greg while I was speaking with another veteran. I couldn't hear everything, only pieces. Your wife. How long? Incredible service, Greg answered politely, but he looked lost. Nearby, Blake attempted humor. A terrible decision. Well, he said too loudly, I guess Sarah does more than cook. Nobody laughed. Not one person. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt like 20. Frank happened to glance in Blake's direction. Just once. That was enough. Blake suddenly found his shoes fascinating. Later, Duke approached me. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not performatively uncomfortable. Actually uncomfortable, which I respected. Sarah! Hi, Duke. He shifted his weight. I owe you an apology. I waited. I didn't know. I smiled politely. Know what? That you were, I watched him struggle. That kind of pilot. I tilted my head. There's more than one kind. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. Finally, he laughed awkwardly. I deserved that. Maybe a little. To my surprise, we both smiled. Not friends, but human. A few minutes later, I found Greg standing alone in a hallway outside the main ballroom. His tie was loose. His shoulders slumped. The crowd noise echoed faintly behind us. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then Greg looked at me. Really looked at me. Maybe for the first time in years. I was scared. I waited. Of what? He swallowed. That people would think you were bigger than me. The honesty caught me off guard. Not because it excused anything. Because it was real. Finally. Painfully real. I folded my arms. What hurt me wasn't that you felt small. His eyes lowered. It was that you kept making me smaller so you'd feel bigger. The words landed. Hard. Greg nodded slowly. Like he'd been expecting them. Maybe he had. I know. His voice cracked. I know. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he looked up. I didn't know how to stand next to someone like you. I took a slow breath. You could have started by standing up for me. Silence. The kind that arrives when nobody has a defense left. Finally, Greg asked the question he'd been carrying all evening. Are you leaving me? I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man I'd loved for 20 years. The man who had hurt me. The man who was finally telling the truth. And I answered honestly. I'm deciding whether I still respect you. For the first time all night, Greg had nothing to say. 3 weeks later, life looked surprisingly normal. Not perfect. Not magically repaired. Just normal. Which after everything that had happened felt strange. The world hadn't stopped turning because of one ceremony. The sun still came up over Dallas every morning. People still fought traffic on Interstate 635. The grocery store still ran out of the good coffee creamer by Saturday afternoon. Life kept moving. The difference was that I had stopped moving backward. That was new. A few days after the event, the phone calls started. Some were pleasant. Some were awkward. A few were genuinely funny. One former crew chief tracked me down through a veterans group and left a voicemail that said, "Took you long enough to become famous." Another simply said, "About time." That one made me laugh. Not because I felt famous. Because I felt seen. There's a difference. For years I had quietly adjusted to being invisible. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself you've matured beyond needing recognition. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's just another way of giving up territory. One morning I was sorting mail at the kitchen counter when I found a florist receipt. No flowers, just the receipt. Apparently Greg had already thrown them away. "What's this?" I asked. He looked up from his laptop. "Oh," a pause. "Blake sent flowers." I blinked. "Really?" Greg nodded. He apologized. I laughed. That was unexpected. "What did the card say?" Greg rubbed the back of his neck. I was out of line. I waited. "That's it." "Pretty much." I laughed harder. Honestly, it was the most sincere thing Blake had probably written in years. The flowers themselves had been donated to a VA clinic waiting room. That seemed like a better use for them. A week later, Duke sent a 3-page email. 3 pages. I know because I made it halfway through the second one before deleting it. The man managed to use the phrase, "with all due respect," 4 separate times. That's usually a warning sign. Still, I appreciated the effort. At least he tried. Not everyone did. Some people simply disappeared. A few of Greg's social friends stopped calling. Certain invitations stopped arriving. Some business relationships cooled slightly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing devastating. Just enough distance to reveal who had valued appearances more than character. The funny thing, I didn't miss any of them. Not even a little. Greg noticed it too. One evening we sat on the back patio watching a thunderstorm build over the city skyline. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon. Lightning flashed in the distance. The smell of rain drifted through the warm air. Greg stared into his coffee cup. "You seem happier." I considered that. Happier isn't the right word. What is... I thought for a moment.